People thought America's empire or America as an ideal would never end. I think if we don't fix these problems, it ends.
It is on.
Hi, everybody. Today I'm talking to Larry Lessig, a Harvard law professor and activist who's an expert in both the internet and political law. I think it's critical that we talk to Larry at this point. Besides being brilliant and someone who knows tech really well, he's also working on a case around SuperPACs, a lot of which are funded by tech billionaires, that I think will be critical in helping bring our democracy back into balance. We'll see. He's got a lot of thoughts on that, including about AI and some other things. And I think it's really important to talk to someone like him at a time when we feel everything is hopeless. It is not. This is a really enlightening conversation, so stick around. Larry, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's start by taking the 30,000 foot view. In the 90s, your work focused on the internet, and that's where I ran into an intellectual property. And you used to give a series of really fascinating presentations, very gripping presentations. And then by the mid 2000s, it shifted to institutional corruption and democracy. Um, that experience in both tech and politics gives you a unique perspective on how so many tech leaders went from being mostly benign, libertarian-light political stance to being active Trump enablers. Talk a little bit about that, because you're kind of in that bucket with Yuval Harari and Sam Harris, who have a much more jaded view now, for both of them who have interviewed recently. So talk a little bit about your evolution.
Well, it happened at a very particular moment. It was around Christmas 2006. A mutual friend of ours, Aaron Schwartz, came to visit me in Berlin. And I was bragging to him about my latest copyright book, and I was going to make my first TED talk about copyright. And he said, "So why do you think you're ever going to make any progress on copyright or internet policy so long as we have this deeply corrupted form of government?" And I said to him, "It's not my field, Aaron." And he said, "You mean as an academic?" I said, "Yeah, as an academic. I do copyright policy and internet policy." And he said, "Well, what about as a citizen? Is it your field as a citizen?" And I realized he had trapped me because I had no good reason. I had tenure. I could work on whatever I wanted. And he was right. There was no way to think about sensible policy here as long as money was so central. And of course, it's almost quaint to think of how insignificant it was relative to where we are today. But so long as money was so central, you weren't going to get sensible policy on those issues. And not just those issues, climate change, healthcare policy, tax policy, none of them. So that night, I promised him I was going to give it up. And I announced I was going to take up this project of institutional corruption. And that's basically been my work the last 19 years.
Why did that convince you? Because money is not a new thing to politics, but something supercharged it, and especially in the last 10 years, especially with tech, which is a group of people you and I are both very familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, I think the critical change, that we've seen today, kind of obscures what the problem looked like back then. Because I don't think at that time anybody was really thinking that major policy was driven by bribery. It wasn't a kind of quid pro quo that stepped in and blocked people from doing the right thing. Instead, what was driving policy was this dependence. Like if you spend 30 to 70% of your time raising money, what that means is you become dependent on that tiny, tiny few who are giving you money. And indeed, when we look at Congress today and we see how weak and pathetic the institution is it any surprise that if you spend your whole career sucking up to people with power,
Hmm.
you develop a kind of sycophancy? You
Hmm.
develop the inability to act on the integrity of your
Hmm.
views. And it was that dependence corruption that I thought was the most important thing to find a way to address. Because if we didn't find a way to address that, then none of the major policies any of us care about could Congress address sensibly. So that was the original focus. It's not illegal corruption that
Hmm.
is the problem. It's legal
Right,
corruption.
right,
It's the
right.
influences that affect the independence or integrity of the institution that you're trying to protect.
Has that become more so with the tech leaders in terms of they've turbocharged everything, social media, they've turbocharged political discourse, and certainly money. Obviously, Musk is the biggest example, but all of them really in a lot of ways, and the numbers are quite staggering.
Yeah, I think what's most striking is that, I mean, I knew these people not well, not as well as you did, but I knew them, 20 years ago. And I think to a person, they would have been repulsed
Mhm.
by the current system that we have. Indeed, many of
Agree.
them talked about being able to build a world where they didn't depend on lobbyists. I mean, Microsoft famously like refused to have lobbyists because they thought we were above that. We could just make great products
Disdainful.
in the
I
world.
had a
Yeah, that's right.
dinner with lunch with Gates where he was, "I don't even know where our lobbyist is." I think that
Yeah,
was
exactly. And so I think that what they saw was that there was an enormous opportunity to profit from basically giving in to the system as it's evolved. So, I naively, like a year and a half ago, if you had asked me, like if you had some kind of authoritarian come in and make demands, these kind of extortion demands of people, like who would be the first people to give in? And I would have said, well, if you're a billionaire, you've got money to burn. Like, why would you give in? Like, why not stand for what you believe in? Or the same thing with universities, or the same thing with law firms. But what's so astonishing is how easily all of these people give in. And, they give in and they rationalize it because they say, this is what my business needs. Like, we
mhm,
have to give in. But of
shareholders.
course, what they're building
Mhm,
is a much weaker economy, a much more vulnerable economy.
mhm,
And they should know that. They do know that. 20 years ago, they knew that.
mhm.
But now they just see in the short term, this is the way to
This
get
will
a
work.
loan.
It's the fastest way,
Yeah.
and they were sort of burned by Biden. They felt burned by Biden's either personally or otherwise. Some of it was emotional in Musk's case. That's certainly the case. So let's get to the lawsuit that could reshape how American elections get funded.
Mm.
Dinner Table Action et al. Versus William Schneider. Walk us through the case and how it could lead to the end of super PACs, because I think Citizens United, of course, everyone sort of points to that as the real moment.
We should recognize that we are extremely vulnerable to these tech super PACs right
Yes.
now. I mean, we
Yes.
saw in the last election that in one election, one super PAC was able to flip crypto policy from being, it's not like it was great policy. It's not like the SEC is a great policy making body, but from sensible policy to crazy policy in one election because they
And
were
got rid
able
of a
to.
US senator, Sherrod
They got
Brown.
rid of a US senator, they scared a bunch of people, they brought other people in, and they took a president who went from calling it a scam to, like, investing in his own, like, meme coin.
Yeah, can I just note something for people to understand? The Wall Street Journal had a story yesterday. The Trump and his family has pulled in about $4 billion linked to his presidency, and much of it comes from crypto and foreign deals that leverage his presidential status. And an investment firm from the UAE bought nearly half of the Trump family's crypto company, making the two business partners in a deal. And we've given away chips to do so. But go ahead. I just want to have people have
Yeah,
that
and of
context.
course, that ties to all sorts of pardon pack. I mean, it's grossest kind of corruption, like, way below the kind of corruption that I was really worried about 20 years ago. But the point to recognize is we will see the same super PACs stood up to address AI policy. Now, AI is extremely complicated. I think it's the best of technology and the worst of technology, or the most dangerous and the most potent. And so I think the one thing we should be able to agree on is we need the capacity to have sensible AI policy. But they're going to buy a Congress that basically is incapable of regulating if super PACs survive. So that's why I think this case is so critical. So in 2024, my group, Equal Citizens, was able to get a ballot initiative on the main ballot that basically said there would be no super PACs in Maine. Now, people say, how is that possible? Didn't the Supreme Court create super PACs in Citizens United? And that's the first big mistake. Citizens United has nothing to do with super PACs. Citizens United was about the freedom to spend money independently of a campaign. Super PACs are the ability to contribute unlimited contributions to the committees that will then spend the money.
Hmm.
And they were created months after Citizens United by a lower federal court decision called Speech Now versus FEC. And it was a kind of logical mistake that it's hard to see at the time, but easy to see in retrospect. The logical mistake was Judge Sentel said, if spending money independently creates no risk of corruption, then contributing money to a committee that will spend money independently also can't create a risk of corruption. Now, that theory was proven false 5 years after that by my favorite Senator Robert Menendez from New Jersey, who was indicted. And the indictment was he promised favors in exchange for a contribution to his super PAC. So there was quid pro quo corruption involving a super PAC, the very thing the DC Circuit said could not happen. And indeed, his lawyers had the chutzpah to file a motion to dismiss the indictment, saying the thing you've accused us of, the DC Circuit says can't happen, so we must be innocent. And of course, the court ignored it. But the point was that revealed the mistake. And since about that time, a bunch of people have been trying to find a way to get the court to consider this because Speech Now, the case that created super PACs, was not appealed to the Supreme Court.
So
So the
there's
court
an
has never,
opening here that
there's a
instead of
huge opening.
okay, so explain the case. Explain the case, and then I want to talk about the legal reasoning grounded in originalism. Even liberal justices Elena Kagan and Judge Jackson both have agreed that, quote, we are all originalists. So explain what the case is and the originalist legal theory you're putting forth.
Right. So the case basically is testing whether Maine has the ability to limit the size of contributions, not the spending, but the size of contributions to independent political action committees. And that's been attacked by two super PACs, backed by Leonard Leo, the most important super PAC macher on
Mm-hmm.
the right.
The Federal Society.
And so we intervened, Equal Citizens intervened, and the state of Maine is defending the initiative as well. Our lawyer, Neil Katyal, has taken on the case because he's convinced we have a clear shot at winning, and we have a clear shot at winning under two separate theories. So one theory is the theory of Citizens United, which says you can regulate, but if and only if there's a risk of quid pro quo corruption.
Mhm.
And in our case, what the district court said, unlike every other lower court before, our district court said, hey, look, there's a risk of quid pro quo corruption. But nonetheless, she crafted some whole new theory of the First Amendment that said, even though there's a risk of corruption, you still can't regulate contributions to super PACs. So that's the most extreme opinion ever in the history of the federal courts, because never has the Supreme Court or any lower court said, if there's a risk of corruption, there's nothing you can do about it. So on the core theory, the core theory for analyzing this, we think we win. But the second theory that we've been pushing is the idea that if these originalists on the court, primarily the conservatives, really want to be serious about their originalism, that under the original meaning of the First Amendment, there should be no doubt that a state or Congress has the power to control the size of contributions to a committee. That's plainly the sort of thing that the framers would never have imagined courts stepping in to regulate, especially when it's targeting a kind of corruption the framers were really focused on, which is this, what I've called dependence corruption, this creating these improper dependencies inside of the court. So that means you've got, I think, an opportunity to
To
get a
appeal.
significant number of these justices on our side. If we win in the First Circuit, we will definitely be in the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court, I feel like this is almost a gift to the Supreme Court, because we're able to say to the Supreme Court, look, you don't have to reverse Citizens United. In fact, you can say Citizens United is correct, and it's under the logic of Citizens United.
Right. It's
But
a
it
way
turns out,
to knock its knees out, essentially.
yeah,
Correct.
well, get rid of the super PACs,
Right.
which still leaves the ability of a corporation to spend money,
Mhm.
or Elon Musk, under Buckley versus Vallejo, which
Mhm.
turned 50 last Friday.
Mhm.
Elon Musk has the ability to spend his money independently, but it would stop 80% of this money because most people
Do it through
don't want to
PACs.
be out there on their own. They want to
Same.
do it
It
through a
wouldn't it, it
contribution to
wouldn't
a
be
political
dark
action
money. It'd be
committee.
very light money. You
Right.
could
It'd
see
be
it.
light
You'd
money.
know who gave the money. Listeners might wrap skeptically the idea that Roberts Court is going to make a good faith effort to reach a decision based on legal principles instead of political expediency, given recent history. But you think Justice Amy Coney Barrett or maybe Justice Neil Gorsuch might be willing to do that? How come?
What's in it for them? Because if they were to go against us, they would have to change the law to even further reduce the ability to police a thing which everybody must recognize is
Mhm.
now a huge problem within our government. I mean,
Mhm.
our initiative was passed with 75% of the vote in
Mhm.
Maine.
Mhm.
A very
So
a
people
very
get
purple
it.
state. People get it. On the right and the left, they get it. And I think that the point is, like, if it's recognized as not a partisan issue, but just a thing where people are just so disgusted with this money, what's in it for the court? And on the other hand, if the court ruled in our favor, um, the country would be like, "Whoa, this is amazing. They are coming down with a decision that 80% of us agree with, and they can do it without ever confessing any error in their earlier decision." So I just don't see what the upside for them is. Whereas the downside, like that they would be seen as just furthering what everybody now perceives as this grotesque system of corruption, would just be catastrophic, I think, for that
So
institution.
they would take I mean, they have made it harder to prosecute corruption before. They're not bothered by precedent. So
Well, it's not clear that they were changing precedent in the kind of weird ways they've developed the interpretation of corruption statutes. But the point is, they would have to change precedent if they were to say that a state cannot regulate where everybody's acknowledging there's a risk of corruption. I mean, that's been the basic principle for 50 years. When Buckley said you can regulate contributions because we can see the risk of corruption there, but you can't regulate independent spending because that is
it's free
not
speech.
coordinated.
Right.
And
That's
that non coordinated speech, therefore, has no interest in regulation because if it's not coordinated, there can't be any quid pro quo, and quid pro quo is the only basis this court has recognized for limiting that speech.
every episode we get an expert to send our guest a question. Yours is about this campaign finance system as it is. Let's hear it.
Hey, Professor Lessig, this is Ellie Honig. I'm currently CNN's senior legal analyst, but much more importantly than that, almost 30 years ago, I was a first-year student in your contracts class at Harvard Law School. And now I get to ask you a question for Kara's podcast. Okay, is it a good idea to just scrap this whole system? It's a mess. There's loopholes everywhere. It's Byzantine. There's no transparency. No one can tell who's donating what to what candidate. Let's get rid of all of that and let's just go to a completely open system. No artificial caps, no limits. Let the First Amendment breathe, but full, immediate online transparency so we will all know exactly who's giving what to who. Is this a crazy idea? Could this work? And thank you for being a great professor many years ago.
Yeah, it's great to see you again. Um, yeah, no, that'd be a disaster, a total disaster. Because first
Say
of all,
why.
people imagine
Hmm.
that transparency solves everything.
Hmm.
Transparency solves nothing.
Hmm.
Nothing. What it does is convince people that it is a corrupt system. I mean, look, we don't know precisely who the dark money comes from, but we know that dark money is in the system in order to buy results, which it does. So the point is, the transparency would convince us of the problem. And what we know when we eliminate caps on contributions is that the number of relevant contributors increasingly shrinks. So you have a
Smaller and smaller power.
smaller number of people who are calling the shots. Right now, I think it's like 300 families that
Hmm.
basically control what happens in our government. I mean, it's banana republic design.
Hmm.
And so that's certainly not what the framers intended.
Hmm.
Madison promised us a House of Representatives, at least, that would be, quote, dependent on the people alone. And he went on to say, by
Not
the
certain
people, he meant,
people. Not
yeah,
certain.
not the rich more than the poor,
Hmm.
explicitly, not the rich more than the poor. Well, we've created a system where it's the rich more than the poor that our politicians are dependent on. And so is it surprising that they are just unable to do anything that addresses problems the vast majority of Americans want to see addressed?
So when Ellie said, how is this different than what you're saying of anybody can give anything? How does it change the super PAC status versus this? What he's talking about?
Well, I mean, super PACs effectively now are the system that he's talking about. I mean, now he says, well, the advantage of just getting rid of everything and requiring transparency is we at least know who it is. And again, I'm saying I don't think we're getting anything from that. That's not going to shame most of them. So the point is, we'd still have a system where it's a tiny few who are able to leverage their power to control federal legislation. I would love a system where we have many, many more people who are contributing or
Hmm.
part of getting money inside of the system, because then if money matters, it's mattering in a democratic way, small d democratic way. It's what we all want. The problem right now is that when it's the super PAC money, it's what the tiniest fraction of a 1% want.
Hmm.
And that's true whether it's
And
Democrats or
hidden, and hidden,
Republicans.
and hidden.
It's hidden, and it's just controlling the issues based on what the tiniest fraction of the richest want. And it
Mhm.
turns out the richest, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, don't want what average Americans want.
Right, which is typically to protect their own fortunes. So where does it go from here? Where does the super PAC case go from here now?
So we just filed the last briefs in the First Circuit Court of Appeals on Friday.
Mhm.
And so now the court will decide when it will hear arguments. Hopefully, they'll hear arguments this spring. If they hear arguments this spring and decide the case by the summer, that means we could be in the Supreme Court in the next term, which would be critically important. Because if we're in the Supreme Court the next term and the court goes with us, depending on how they write that opinion, that could end super PACs by 2028, which means the next presidential election won't be with a last where super PACs were dominating what both parties were able to talk about.
Mhm.
Many people look at Kamala Harris
Mhm.
and they say Kamala Harris failed to address issues that ordinary people cared about. But I feel kind of sorry for her because the reason she couldn't is that her campaign was so tied down with the extraordinary amount of money it was taking from these super PACs or getting from these super PACs. But if you could eliminate that from the system, you would give them the freedom to be able to be who they actually want to be as opposed to who the money says they must be. And so there's a chance if we get this right and get this through the First Circuit quick enough that we could fix this problem by the next presidential election, but not by 2026.
Not by 2026. So be clear, Elon Musk or any other billionaires who've been very active lately could still spend hundreds of millions of dollars on electing whoever he wants.
So since Buckley 50 years ago, Elon Musk has been free to take his money and spend it independently of campaigns. Buckley created that power, not Citizens United. Citizens United extended it to corporations and labor unions. But that was a kind of one small step from the idea that individuals could do it. So that still is going to exist until the Constitution is amended and Citizens United and Buckley have been overturned. But the point is, that's not the big problem. I mean, it's our focus because we look at Elon Musk. But the reality is, Elon Musk's money is not terribly effective anymore
Mhm.
because when P comes into a district and he spends his money, like what happened in Wisconsin, the very fact that he's spending that money becomes an argument against it. So it's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is the ability for people to be sucked into this system in a way that is hidden and makes it so the influence that they are exercising is not an influence that anybody needs to be accountable for. That's super PACs. And if we can end super PACs, we don't have a perfect system, but we can begin to move on to the kind of changes to the system that would actually make it an even better system.
One last thing. What is their best case against your case from your perspective? You've got to be sussing that out.
Yeah, I think the strongest case that they've got is kind of like the question I just addressed. This is so. Why don't we just wipe all this away and let transparency rule? And and the argument, so that's the argument that just let's step back and just have no regulation here at all. But the reason that's really troubling is that, the whole idea of a democracy is that the democratic representatives get to enact laws unless the Constitution clearly says they can't. And when you say that the democratic legislatures are not allowed to address corruption, you've got to answer the question, when in our past did we, the people, in some supermajority way say, yes, we do not allow corruption to be addressed. Corruption must be constitutionally protected inside of our democracy. And the answer is never, never. That was never the resolution of we, the people, in 1787, in 1868. There was never a point where we said that. And so the real question for these activist judges is, who the hell are you to be blocking democratic legislatures and, in Maine's case, the largest number of Maine voters to vote for anything in the history of Maine, more than any candidate, more than any initiative. Who the hell are you to be saying no to them when you're not actually standing on anything that the Constitution ever articulated? It's just your own made up theory about money is speech and blah, blah, blah that turns out to produce this zone where there can't be regulation, and that's the argument against them.
So there's a lot of other cases in news related to election law. I want to ask you about a couple more, if you don't mind. The Supreme Court is considering whether Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is constitutional without it states could dilute minority voting power and potentially flip dozens of seats from Democratic from Democrat to Republican. You ran for president in 2015. I don't think people remember that. I do. And one of your main platforms was strengthening the Voting Rights Act. Talk about the long term consequences of gutting Section 2.
Yeah, I mean, this is a disaster that is, again, without any basis in the Constitution, because we have an express constitutional amendment that is giving to Congress the power to address this problem, both in the voting context and in the 14th Amendment equality context. And instead of yielding to the decision of our framers to say Congress gets to make these laws, you have a court that
Hmm.
increasingly arrogates to itself the power to second guess Congress's judgment.
Hmm.
And again, by what right? Like, why do they get to do that? So it is an incredible step backwards, not justified by anything other than a political preference of those who happen to be in the majority right now. And I would think that at a certain point they would have the humility to recognize that whether they agree with the objective of equal freedom to vote or not, they don't have a constitution that gives them the power, legitimate power to block it.
Yeah.
But
From
they
the
don't seem
states
to be
again.
slowing.
So the court is also considering a case brought by California Republicans against Gavin Newsom. They're trying to block the state from redistricting in response to the new Texas map. You opposed gerrymandering, but you posted this on Twitter. Quote, every Democrat in the 117th Congress voted for the bill that would have ended partisan gerrymandering, and every Republican voted against. The GOP didn't want to disarm. This is a consequence of their decision. Looking ahead, what's the most feasible solution to undoing all the extreme gerrymanders we're going to end up with?
Well, Congress can address federal gerrymanders. So the bill that almost passed,
Hmm.
part of the For the People Act,
Hmm.
would have ended gerrymandering. There wouldn't have been any of this game at the federal level. There still would be state gerrymandering
Hmm.
because the Supreme Court has said that the Constitution does not block partisan gerrymandering.
Hmm.
The real question is whether the next Congress will be kind of exhausted by the games that went on in this election cycle and pull back from it. And I think that what we need is people on both sides to begin to stake the principled position gerrymandering is terrible and we should end it. Now, I think that given that principle, it doesn't follow that you can't play the game so long as the rules are the way the rules are. Just
Hmm.
like, I set up a super PAC a
Right.
decade ago to try to end super PACs.
Hmm.
And the point was we're going to do what we can under the existing
So we'll
rules
play
to
by your
change the
shitty
rules. We'll
rules.
play
Yeah.
by your rules, right? But you can still be arguing, and you should be arguing to change the rules to the right rules, and the right rules would end this gerrymandering. The biggest reason for that is, the political system is supposed to be responsive to what the people care about. But even if there's a overwhelming victory for the Democrats, it won't actually be that significant
Hmm.
because so many of these districts have been drawn in a way that make it so that nothing really matters. People go
Hmm.
to the polls, they know that my vote doesn't matter because it's been crafted in a way so the politicians are picking the voters rather than the voters picking the
That's really well
politicians.
said.
And so I think that we've got to recognize that we need to make democracy responsive to the people. And gerrymandering is one way in which it isn't. Money in politics is another way in which it isn't. Suppressing of the freedom of vote is another way in which it isn't.
Hmm.
We need partisans on both sides to begin to take a principled position about the need to end this partisan pollution of our
Well, it
democracy.
hasn't, though. The FBI raided Fulton County's election, talking about devaluing votes, headquarters, and seized all the ballots cast in the county in 2020, along with registration rolls and other records. So, what's the best strategy for maintaining a functioning democracy when Trump and the Republican Party seems committed to doing everything to ensure this one party rule? So, talk about this raid for people to understand what's happening
Yeah, I mean, the strategy is to terrify these local jurisdictions,
and their
so that
election officials.
yeah, their election officials, so that he can effectively exercise control over the election process. And that's wrong on two fronts. Number one, the presumption of our Constitution is that election systems are run locally.
Hmm.
And the only exception to that is if Congress passes a law to make exceptions to that. And that law only governs federal elections. It doesn't govern state elections. And so Trump is, number one, believing that he has the right to control how states run their election systems and that he has that right even if Congress hasn't acted. So, for example, in Colorado, he punished the state of Colorado by saying, I'm going to take the Space Force headquarters
Hmm.
and move it to Alabama. Why? Because you have mail in voting. Now, first of all, the idiocy of criticizing mail in voting as a
Hmm.
form of like corruption is just beyond measure. But the point is, he has no power as the president to second guess Colorado's decision to have mail-in ballots.
But he does
If
have the
Congress
ability to
he
hurt them.
has he has a he has a practical ability to hurt them. And this is the pattern we've seen with him again and again. It's this extortionist kind of mob boss like pattern. It's like he knows if he sets the price of extortion low enough, enough to hurt, but not too much to make it so nobody would give into it, he can always win. That's what he did with 9 law firms who caved to him, even though the legal basis he was asserting had zero basis in the law. That's what he did to media organizations, CBS, ABC, Amazon, Meta, all of these companies that basically realized even if though he had no basis for his claims, we're going to cave into him because it's cheaper than fighting.
Mhm.
That attitude encourages the extortionist, and we see the consequence of it. And so, when you ask what's ultimately going to stop it,
Yeah, what's the
I
best
mean,
strategy?
well, ultimately, all we've got left right now on the field is the court's willingness to step up. I mean, the framers never thought that would be the solution. The
Mhm,
framers thought separated powers would mean Congress
mhm,
would be the first line of defense
mhm,
against authoritarian president. Well, of course, our Congress is pathetic.
mhm,
It's not doing anything. So then the second line of defense would be the people. But again, gerrymandering basically means that even the people don't have power enough to address this kind of threat. So the third line of defense, all that we've got left are the courts. And the problem is this court has so far been hesitant to draw clear lines that force him to behave, to live up to the legal standards. Now, I have a bet with my colleague Jack Goldsmith, who, he and I spend enormous amount of times talking through this. He thinks they're about to do something, a series of cases that will eventually draw sand in the line and force Trump to abide by the Constitution, and that they've been waiting until he's weak enough to be able to do that. And I hope he's right. I don't see the evidence yet that that's what they're going to do. But if they do that, then that might be enough to staunch this effort in the states to basically terrify them into yielding power to the president so he can muck up the 2026 in midterm elections.
mhm. What if they don't?
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, what are we willing to do?
mhm,
I'll sign up for anything.
mhm,
I mean, this is a constitutional crisis.
mhm.
And, we're so used to being able to engage in politics, sort of, sitting on our couch and like tweeting. It might be that we need to get off our couch and like get into a context where we can begin to engage with other Americans. Now, I think the critical thing from my perspective is to find a way to talk across to other people. I did something before the last election I've never done, which is I went to a high school reunion.
Mm.
I grew up in the kind of Kentucky part of Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah,
So
I
I
know
knew
that
that
one.
most of my friends, were going to vote for Trump. And I couldn't
That's where
understand
my
it. I really,
family's from, but go ahead.
is that right?
Mhm,
Yeah.
near there.
So I went back there to kind of talk to them,
Mhm,
because I said, the values I feel like we grew up with, I don't understand how you can
mhm,
support this man.
mhm,
And one of my friends, who was a kind of
mhm,
high school sports star, so way above my
mhm,
coolness level,
mhm,
had he and I started a podcast where we
mhm,
were trying to engage to kind of
mhm,
see why we don't agree or don't see the things in the same way.
mhm,
And it's been enormously enlightening. I mean,
mhm,
from my favorite moment was like when he said, we were talking about the J6 pardons, and he
mhm.
said, "Well, Larry, at least he didn't pardon everybody. He only pardoned the nonviolent people." And I said,
No.
"Ben, what are you talking
Yeah,
about?
it's
He
lacking.
pardoned everybody." And it was clear to both of us
Mhm.
that we all were living in our own little bubbles,
Absolutely.
and the only way to solve that is to launch a practice. I mean,
Mhm,
it's not necessarily starting a podcast, but
mhm,
launch a practice of reaching across and trying to find
mhm,
a way to rebuild something of a common ground when
mhm.
the business model of media is committed to finding a way to break that common ground, to turn us into ignorant people who hate each other.
Let's talk about that the deleterious effect, because I do think it is linked to tech, AI, and tech billionaires. This is my area, and a lot of tech billionaires, as you know, turned up in the recent Epstein files. And I think for people who haven't been part of that, don't understand how quickly, like, you can have Steve Bannon hanging out with a Democrat and stuff like that, and like all the different interactions between these people, including Elon Musk, who emailed Epstein to ask about, quote, the wildest party on your island. Now, you made news a few years ago when you wrote an essay explaining why you signed a petition supporting Joey Ito. I wrote a very negative negative column about him in the New York Times, as you know. He was a former director of the MIT Media Lab. He resigned after the news that he had solicited and accepted donations from the lab from Epstein. Um, I know Ito has spoken to you privately about the donations, and you didn't tell him not to take the money. In an essay, in fact, you said Ito shouldn't have taken the money and that you wish you'd counseled him not to. But you say people accept if institutions accept money from people like Epstein, and he's the worst of them, but there's lots of gradations of this. They should do it anonymously to avoid laundering the reputations of these unsavory characters. And I want to understand how you think about this, because part of it is they also invade institutions, these tech billionaires and others, not just them, but they try to overtake these places that are supposed to be, as you say, fair and try to find common ground, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote that essay because I was furious about the scapegoating that was going on. I mean, I also wrote an essay attacking Harvard because Harvard, scapegoated Martin Novak, who's not a friend. I mean, I've never met Martin before, by writing a report that makes it seem like he did everything. And the actual man behind the scenes, Larry Summers, never appeared anywhere in that account. And so I wrote that in 2021. I
Well,
wrote
that's
another one
out
just
now,
last
but
year.
go ahead.
Yeah, that's out now,
Yeah.
right? But the point is, in my view, the real problem are these institutions that like put these people into a position where they do this, and then they hide and they say that we have nothing to do with
Very
it.
much
Now,
like
but
Congress is what you're saying,
yeah,
right?
exactly right.
Mhm.
But I want to be very clear about something because you came close to saying it exactly right, but I want to make sure that
Good,
it's
okay.
perfectly clear. I mean, what I said in that essay was that if you take money from a person like Epstein,
Mhm,
I can quote it exactly. It was a mistake to take this money, Epstein's money, even if it was anonymous. Now,
mhm,
that's different, I
mhm,
think, from, for example, taking money from a tax cheat. So if
mhm,
a tax cheat, gets out of jail and he says, I want to give $50 million to MIT, MIT can take that money,
mhm,
just shouldn't will launder the reputation of the tax cheat. But what
mhm.
I said in the essay was
Milken.
a case
Milken's a
like
good
this.
example of that, right?
Yeah,
For
Milken's a good example.
Mhm,
But Epstein is different because if you are a victim of sex abuse, as I said in that essay, I averted to a John Heilemann article about me talking about the fact that I spent 3 years in a school being abused when I was 12, 11, 12, and 13, abused in a school as a child. So I feel this viscerally. This issue is visceral for me. And so what I said was in the context of even if it's anonymous, you should not take money from somebody like that because, if you're somebody who has been abused like this and you discover that the building you're in is funded by an abuser, that is a wrong, that is a harm that nobody should minimize. And so it was kind of bizarre to me how hard it was to kind of make that distinction because earlier in the essay was describing the conversations Joey and I had. And what I was saying was, you know, ha- suffering abuse, obviously, it fundamentally affects your judgment on everything. And at that stage, it was coming to the place where I was thinking I was overdoing it. Like I was seeing abusers everywhere. I was completely condemning all sorts of things I didn't really wasn't really sure. And so when Joey asked me this and I said to him, like, are you sure that he is not what people worry about and whether, are you sure that he is not perpetrating this kind of abuse with
mhm,
minors?
mhm.
And Joey said, from what I can see, that's true. Um,
And he was wrong.
the stupidity was I thought to myself, okay, you're going to react against this,
Mhm,
and that's just your abuse speaking. So I backed off. I said, "Okay, if you're confident about that, that makes sense." But from
mhm,
somebody like Epstein
mhm,
or, somebody involved in some murder, whatever, the point is
mhm,
there's a category of these wrongs
mhm.
that should never be taken, even if it's anonymous.
So when you are thinking like that, because you were talking about the larger institutional problem of having to take money, because then on the flip side, you have someone like Bill Ackman bossing everybody around, right, with his own whatever strange set of mentality he has. But taking money is an institutional problem over a Joey Ito problem, whatever they, as you say, force them into doing this. It's a complex issue, but explain why, so say if dark money is bad in politics, on the other hand, institutions are going to have to take money from some people who aren't pure as the driven snow. How can you do that with these institutions, for example,
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, the first point is it's a terrible thing that we depend in all sorts of contexts
on the
on
kindness of
interested
billionaires?
money.
Yeah,
Yeah, the kindness of billionaires.
they're not
I mean,
kind.
not just because they're not kind, right? They also steer research in ways that have no necessary relationship to what's the direction it should go. And so I think we've lost an enormous amount that because we've handed over those decisions to smaller groups of people who can make them for reasons that are unrelated to what actually benefits. Um, but I think that the point is the institution needs to think about is how do we preserve a reason for people to trust us? And if people think that the reason you're doing what you're doing is you're trying to suck up to your donor, they won't trust you. They won't trust what you say, and I don't blame them. Um, I uh, I was once testifying, way in the days when I was doing work around the internet, testifying about network neutrality. I got a text from Senator Sununu who said to me, "I can't believe you're up here shilling for Google." And I thought, "Holy shit, he thinks that I'm being paid by Google." And then I thought, "Well, of course he thinks I'm being paid by Google,
Mhm,
because most of my colleagues who would
mhm,
be coming to testify are
mhm,
actually testifying because 'cause they're being paid."
mhm,
Some of them acknowledge that, but not everybody acknowledges
mhm.
that. And that's part of the work that we were doing in the lab was to say, "This is wrong." Like, if you're gonna be giving and I have a disclosure statement on my website to say this, if you're gonna be giving advice about policy, you cannot be taking money from the people who are interested in that policy. You cannot be in a position where you depend on them. And if you are, you shouldn't be talking about it like that. We should be able to craft policy recommendations that are distinct from private
I get it,
dependence.
but you know how
Uh,
insidious it is that like Google News giving money to public. I mean, I got attacked. We didn't take the money, but you could see how easy it would be to do so. So I
of
never
course,
particularly judged people for it, but it was so, they'd invite you to like, let's talk about where news is going. I'm like, no, not with you. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you know that you and I have been sort of privy to that.
I mean, we first have to admit it's really complicated, especially if we're going to depend on private support. But I think we should not turn away from it just because it's complicated.
No,
Yes, we need to draw complicated lines, and that's what my essay was trying to do. Now,
mhm.
I wasn't rewarded for the
No,
essay
no,
because it
I knew
created
what
all
you were
that
saying.
trouble, but the point is, we can say that certain kinds of contributors should be treated differently.
Hmm.
So Taylor Swift wants to give money to universities, celebrate it. Like,
Hmm.
'cause that money is pure, like,
Hmm.
it's wonderful.
Hmm.
And if Google wants to give money, I get that people are, like, conflicted about
But be
Google, but I
clear.
also think they're be clear Google's giving them money.
Right. That.
But once you cross the criminal line,
Mhm.
then there are 2 categories. Those you can do anonymously, and those you cannot take at all.
Right.
Epstein, given who he turned out to be, at least as people saw it, people came to see,
Mhm.
should never have,
He was
accepted any of that
everywhere. I
money
don't
at
think
all.
people understand. What I think was surprising for those emails was how he was everywhere, and I remember
Yeah.
him being everywhere. All the events and showing up with lots of money and dinners and stuff like that. He was trying very hard to launder himself, and people allowed him to do it. So you characterize the 2024 election as a populist backlash against insiders by voters who feel like outsiders. Obviously, what was gross about the Epstein notes was how they cozied and chatted up with him. Can Democrats use those to show that Trump and his tech CEO friends are real elites and untrustworthy? Because I think that right now, tech people are starting to go through the real ringer in terms of their reputation, whether it was through Doge and Musk is in the center of a lot of it, but it's all of them. Does that help or hurt as people begin to not like billionaires quite so much?
I think, it really depends on whether there's a Democrat who can credibly articulate the other side. And the other side is not anti-populist, it's pro-populist. It's a side that says, look, you were right. We do have a system that sucks up to the elite. And look, the Epstein files are just one dimension of it. You can see it everywhere. And we have got to change that corruption. But you thought Donald Trump was going to change that corruption for you. Look what happened. The guy's $4 billion richer because of that corruption, because of that elite. Those tech firms are sucking up to him and giving him everything he wants. Amazon pays $40 million for a documentary about his wife. That is not what you were angry about. That is not what you were fighting for. And so is there a Democrat who can credibly say to that populist base, you picked the wrong horse to fight your fight, but there is a side that would fight your fight and would implement policies that would address this kind of elite corruption. And, I mean, one of the big problems, though, is whether that message gets out, whether that message is reached. So I don't know if
Oh,
you
I think
remember
it
the
is. I think people
series.
go ahead.
I mean, let's hope. I mean,
Mhm,
there's this series, the great television series Scandal,
mhm.
and there's one episode just
Great
in
show.
2016 before Trump became Trump,
Mhm.
where there's a Trump-like
There
character,
is.
and he's like a big populist.
Mhm,
And then Kerry Washington catches him on tape, like
mhm,
admitting that all of his base is just,
mhm.
basically hillbillies, and he hates all of them. And that leaks. And once that leaks, his support disappears. Well, that's just liberal fantasies
Yes, it is.
because
It
it's
is.
like
Yep.
dreaming,
There was a
but just
Katharine
get the
Hepburn
facts
movie,
out
Man of
there.
the People,
Yeah.
back
Yeah, that's
then.
exactly right.
Yeah,
Exactly right.
same thing.
But, we don't have that
Mhm.
media ecosystem anymore.
Well, it
And like
depends on the person, because when Mitt Romney did it, it worked, right? When he
it
caught
was a different,
yeah, it was a
even that
different
was a different
he's a
media
different
ecosystem.
person too. I mean, it does
Yeah,
depend. I
that's
mean
right.
I mean, I think Trump is Huey Long, like, didn't die,
Yeah,
that
that's
kind
right.
of thing. So let's end by talking about, artificial intelligence. You've written the quote, "Observing that AI could be used for good is like observing that bulldozers could be used to help build affordable public housing. It is possible, of course, but is it likely? It is not." Talk a little bit about the ways to regulate it.
Well, I mean, everybody's focused on the next AI, the future AI, and like scary fears about, runaway AI, or if we build it, if anybody builds it, everybody dies. And I think those are important problems to focus on. But we need to recognize old AI, the AI that drives social media, is the present threat. And that present threat has turned us into people that can't even hear each other, ignorant people who hate each other. And that will continue to be deployed and perfected as the algorithms driving your media, your consumption of engagement-based media become ever better at figuring out how to trigger you and get you to do what they want you to do, which is to spend more time focused on the device. The only way to fix that is to blow it up. Literally blow it up. Well, figuratively, literally blow it up. And we could do it legally. So, for example, imagine Congress passed an engagement tax that basically taxed a quadratic engagement tax. So taxed on the basis of engagement. So 1 unit, it's $1, 2 units, it's 4, 3 units, it's 9. At a certain point, the platform would be like, "Hey, Lessig, go take a walk. Like
Mhm,
you're costing us too much money to be on that platform."
mhm,
My point is that's totally constitutional.
mhm,
And if you did it, you would blow up the business model, and
mhm.
they would have to figure a different way to try to make
Yes,
money, one that wasn't focused on constantly getting us to
enragement.
spend our time enraged based on what we're being fed.
Yeah.
But to get something like that requires a functioning Congress,
See
and we
Congress
don't.
not
Yeah,
functioning from
we don't
question
have a
1.
functioning Congress,
Yeah.
right? So I think this is like the problem of the age. I'm just finishing a book where the first it's on the metaphor is the Titanic, and it's like you hit the iceberg and you see the ice on the deck, and you're like, okay, we can fix that. But then you have the gash in the hull, and it's like, doesn't matter if we fix that, we're going down. Well, the equivalent is like the democracy reform stuff I've been doing for 20 years. We came close to fixing that. We know how to fix it. We could fix all of that stuff. But this engagement-based media is the gash in the hull.
And you
You get
can't
a
sue them,
perfectly
and you
you
can't sue.
can't sue them.
So you were let me just be clear, you were once a beloved figure within the tech world for being an open source champion and pushing back against regulation. And they don't like you so much, or they don't like me anymore at all. They don't like Yuval Harari, they don't like Sam Harris, who've been outspoken. But you've spoken out against open source AI models too, and you're a vocal supporter of California AI safety bill. Has the reality of generative AI undone some of your original assumptions?
Well, look, I think 1047 or the California regulations were important just to make sure that we knew what was going on inside those companies. I mean, I defended some of the whistleblowers, Daniel Coccatello, who came out and was willing to give up 2 million of his own dollars in order to have the freedom to speak. Turned out he didn't have to do that, yet OpenAI. And one of the purposes of that bill was to make it so whistleblowers could know and identify problems with what was going on inside those companies. That has nothing to do with open source. What I wrote in Economist about open source was open source is extremely valuable. I think it's become even more important, especially to assure access across the world. But I said that there's going to be a point at which the models become sufficiently powerful that we need to make sure that we can assure that they are not deployed in ways that are catastrophic to humanity. And I don't think we're there yet. We're not at that point. It's just about a point about you can't think in binary ways about this. Like
Hmm.
there's a risk there's a certain point at which the risk becomes overwhelming,
Hmm.
even if we're nowhere close to it now. And we have to begin to think about what do we need to make it possible to regulate in that context.
You've spoken out about the AI's potential to destroy democracy. You say, as you said, will supercharge the media business models that rely on engagement, which leads to enragement, increased polarization, and shatters the shared reality that's necessary for democracy. And your solution has been the citizen assemblies. Talk us through your thinking given the scale of the problem you described. Citizen assemblies can sound quaint and Pollyannish as a solution, but then you see Minneapolis. You see it. Like you could start to
Yeah.
see it. You believe technology could decentralize power and strengthen democracy, but the opposite is true. So, talk a little bit about that.
Well, what we know about people who've seen and experienced citizen assemblies is that they trigger in those people this kind of aha moment. Like it's the first time they're doing anything related to government or politics, and they feel like this is something powerful and different. And what it's able to do is to take people who have very different views about the world and get them to come to an understanding and propose solutions that are meaningful, real solutions. And that experience is something that when people see it or have it, they begin to recognize that the world of professional politicians is not the only world we could have. Indeed, one of my favorite books here is a book called Against Elections by von Raybrook. And he starts the book by saying, we've had thousands of years of history of democracy, but only a couple hundred years where elections have been the sole way in which we pick our leaders. And indeed, Aristotle and Montesquieu both said if you have elections, you will tend towards aristocracy.
Hmm.
But if you pick
Well, it was
leaders
the
in a
Jefferson.
random
It was the Jefferson fight with
yeah,
Hamilton
you
too.
pick them. You pick them in a more random, in a random representative way. Then you'll tend towards democracy and citizen assemblies, if done right. Random representative groups of
Jury.
people who
It's
are
a
brought
jury you're
together.
talking about.
It's a big jury. It's a statistically significant jury.
Mm.
Given information, given a chance to deliberate, can produce solutions that our government can't. I mean, sometimes I think we should just call it the government games, where
Hmm.
we impanel a series of citizen assemblies to address the problems Congress is supposed to address, and we give them 2 years. And at the end of 2 years, we say, which of these two institutions actually came up with real solutions to these problems? And I guarantee you,
You'd
I
have to
would
pay
bet
them a
a
lot,
year.
right? Give them for their time, right?
Turns out, no, I mean, maybe you do, but turns out the ones that have succeeded, you don't have to pay them a terribly large amount. I'm a strong believer that we've got to support them to make sure everybody can participate and they don't lose anything from participating, not like jury pay, but like real pay. But regardless, whatever we have to pay them, if you could begin to address problems like climate change or inequality or tax policy or whatever, that would be worth it. And these bodies surprisingly turn out to be able to do much more effectively than ordinary government. I mean, it feels like a kind of Rocky moment when, you know, uh, um, Rocky like surprises the world that he can at least stay in the ring
Hmm.
with Apollo Creed, and in Rocky 2, he's able to defeat Apollo Creed. And we are Rocky in this story, like a random representative body of citizens sitting
Right.
down and addressing COVID policy,
Hmm.
or addressing climate change policy turn out to be more effective at getting real
Have you
solutions
seen an
that
inflection point?
yeah, so this is happening everywhere
Hmm.
around
It
the
is.
world and increasingly in the United States. I mean, I don't want to oversell the possibility.
Hmm.
It's not something that in the next year or next 5 years is going to be present enough so people can imagine it or see it. Many people, polling, they'll say, yeah, I would think a random group of Americans would be better than Congress. And maybe they believe that. But I think people can be easily frightened
Hmm.
by the idea of random representatives because when
That
they think of
idiot.
any
Yeah, I don't like
rando,
that
it's like
idiot.
that guy, right? And of course, there will be idiots, but
Yeah.
they'll only be 5% idiots. Like
Hmm.
95% will be like
10.
decent, normal people,
Yeah.
10% idiots, or whatever. But the point is, like, we need to demonstrate it. And if
Yeah,
we demonstrated it more
I
and
agree
more
with you.
people began to see this can actually solve the problem that government can't, I think you're going to see more power being given to them to at least constrain or put guardrails on what our government
Yeah,
can
you
do.
see people reacting to it. So my last question, if we don't meaningfully rein in these super PACs, getting back to your first part, we were talking about strengthen voting rights, address the national populist backlash against elites, and regulate AI, what happens to American democracy? What does it look like 10 years, 20 years if we keep heading down the path? And what could it look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think, people thought America's empire or America as an ideal would never end. I think if we don't fix these problems, it ends. I think, it's ugly. I mean, how does it end? Like, what was there a division? Is it like who do we become? But I think that the world that we imagine ourselves contributing to, like the values that I think we imagined standing for, have begun to collapse. And we don't have a mechanism to pull it back together if we don't solve these core corruptions. Now, I think we should be simple about it. Let's start with the money. Like that is the core, that is the foundational. For every 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, there's one striking at the root. This is the root. And if you don't find a way to address this, none of the other changes, voting rights, none of those things are going to matter. But if we solve this problem, if we can take down the super PACs and at least open up the opportunity for other influences to matter, then we have something to fight for. Whether you think we'll succeed or not, I think you should fight for it. And, I understand the argument that there's no hope, there's no reason to be fighting because we can't succeed. But I don't think you're allowed to take that position. If you love your country, like if you love your child, you will do anything you can regardless of the odds. And that's what we should be doing right now. Whatever it takes, we've got to find a way to restore or establish a democracy that speaks for the people, not for the tiniest fraction of the 1% who can buy elections or can corrupt the system so that it responds to them, whether through threats or through incentive.
Yeah, something I always say to people when they say we can't do anything, I said, they're so poor, all they have is money. Like, you don't
Yes,
understand. I'm telling you,
it's
they're
great.
beatable.
That's really good.
Please borrow it and put it around. Anyway, Larry, as usual, what a fascinating discussion, and we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Today's show was produced by Christian Castor Russell, Michelle Eloy, Megan Burney, and Kaylin Lynch. Nishat Kurwa is Vox Media's executive producer of podcasts. Special thanks to Eamon Whalen, and our theme music is by Trackademics. If you're already following the show, the Roberts Court will stick to its originalist principles. If not, hello, unlimited dark money forever. Thanks for watching. See you on Monday.